My husband's family gave me strange looks when I announced my pregnancy, but later I found out why, and I got my revenge on all of them. I'm a 28-year-old woman, and my husband Ron, who is 34, is going through a major problem, and I'd like to know if what I'm about to do is the right thing. To give you some context, I met my husband 4 years ago, and I still remember the day we met like it was yesterday. I used to frequent the same cafe, and I guess he must have noticed me because one morning he approached me and asked for my number. Ron is incredibly handsome and seemed to work in finance just like me, so I didn't hesitate much before giving him my number. He called me, we talked, and decided to go on a date. From the very start, Ron was very transparent about his family's wealth. He told me how his dad had worked hard to become one of the top real estate agents to provide his family with a very luxurious life. He asked about my family, and I explained how I came from a low-income household but had worked hard to become an accountant. I had a good income and was self-sufficient, which was a dream come true for someone with my background. At first, everything seemed perfect between Ron and me. He took me to fancy dinners, gave me expensive gifts, and endlessly talked about his family's wealth. He lived in a spacious mansion, drove luxury cars, and wore designer clothes without a second thought. Coming from humble beginnings myself, I must admit I was captivated by his lifestyle and also felt a bit intimidated. I told him he was free to find someone of his status, but despite our different upbringings, Ron and I connected on a deeper level. I had a stable job that I was proud of, and he admired my determination and work ethic. When I met Ron's family for the first time, I couldn't help but notice the air of arrogance around them. Their mansion was like something out of a magazine, filled with expensive art and luxurious decor. However, what struck me the most was how cold and distant they were toward me. From our first meeting, his mother refused to shake my hand and blatantly ignored me. It was as if she had immediately assumed I was only interested in Ron for his money, and she made that clear through her behavior and probing questions about my background. His parents wanted to know everything about my upbringing, education, and career, almost as if they were assessing whether I was worthy of being with Ron. His older sister kept asking whether I really met Ron at that cafe, or if it was some elaborate scheme to run into him. No matter how many times Ron and I clarified that he had been the one to approach me, and that I had no idea who he was, she wouldn't believe us, saying, "Everyone knows who we are." To be honest, I really hadn't heard of them or seen them before, since I didn't grow up in such a wealthy neighborhood. Despite their insults and snide remarks, I kept my mouth shut. By the end of the meeting, his dad admitted that I seemed like a hard-working woman, but said he had always envisioned his son marrying someone of their status. This really offended me because I had never asked Ron to fund my lifestyle, and it wasn't my fault where I came from. At the end of the day, all the challenges I faced made me the independent person I am, and I wasn't going to be ashamed of that. After this meeting, I told Ron I was done meeting his parents, and that he would be seeing his family alone next time because I didn't want to go through such scrutiny again. He tried to protest, but I stood firm in my decision and told him how humiliating it was. I also pointed out that my parents never treated him that way, so his parents had no right to be so cold and unwelcoming to me. In the end, he agreed, and ever since then, he has always gone to meet his family alone. However, despite what his family thought, our relationship continued to flourish, and soon we were talking about moving in together. I should add that this was entirely Ron's idea. You see, my lease renewal was coming up, and I was looking for a bigger place to move into with my dog. When Ron suggested that we move in together, we had been dating for 10 months at the time, so I was a little hesitant. However, he tried to reason with me, saying he envisioned spending the rest of his life with me, and that moving in together was the next logical step in our relationship. I took a few days to think it over, but in the end, I agreed. His house, which had been bought by his father, was truly grand, but it always felt a bit cold, like when you walk into a showroom designed by an interior decorator where everything is carefully curated but lacks the warmth of a lived-in home. I turned his cold, lifeless house into a home. We had agreed to split the expenses, and I didn't mind since I liked paying my own way, and I didn't have to pay any rent there anyway. I think this was when I started noticing more about his life. Now that we were living together, up until then, I had always been dazzled by his charms and the luxurious lifestyle he projected. One of the first things that caught my attention was the emptiness of his daily routine. Although he worked in finance, he rarely went to his office except for 1 day a week. He told me that his boss was a friend of his father's, so he didn't have to go to the office every day, which I guess made sense. However, instead of working from 9 to 5, he would easily get bored and irritated and go shopping. I'd be in the office when he'd send me multiple photos of himself wearing different luxury brands of shoes, asking me which ones I liked more. This happened at least 3 times a week, but it was his money, so I didn't say anything. Afterward, whenever he bought a pair, He'd click and post multiple photos of what he'd purchased and constantly check his phone to see if his friends or followers responded to his story. Ron had become somewhat of an influencer since he always posted luxury items, so I guess that's why he was always on his phone, seeking validation and approval. His social media friends would sometimes invite him to parties, but he never took me along, giving me excuses like they didn't allow a +1 and he wanted to make new friends on his own. Still, I kept my mouth shut, though it annoyed me a bit. Later, he bought a luxury sports car. I don't even know how anyone can pay that much money for just a four-wheeled vehicle. While all this was happening, I noticed he had no interest in paying bills. Despite our agreement to split the bills, he always ended up telling me to cover everything, and this included his phone and cable bills, which I didn't even use. If I ever brought it up, he would tell me that we were partners, and that since he let me stay rent-free, I should contribute more. Looking back, I don't think my issue was paying his bills, but rather the gut feeling I had that something about him just wasn't right. If he was wealthy enough to buy luxury shoes, clothes, and cars, why did he need help paying the bills? Of course, I was grateful I could stay in his house rent-free, but I didn't mind paying rent and living on my own if it meant I only paid for my own bills, unlike him. I had a fixed budget and wanted to save as much money as possible to start a family someday. I felt he needed to do the same because if that wasn't our goal, then I didn't want to be with him. I decided to have a serious conversation where I told him all this very frankly and gave him the option to break up with me if we weren't on the same page. However, he assured me he very much wanted to start a family with me and that I was a reliable woman. He told me he was going to stop spending so much money. I thought everything would be fine after that. But one day, while cleaning his garage on a weekend when he was playing golf, I discovered that Ron had been living a facade in front of everyone, including me. It turned out most of what he flaunted was financed through debts and loans. His luxury car and designer wardrobe were purchased on credit. There were recent credit bills he had avoided paying. I was shocked when I went through the bills he had apparently hidden inside a shoebox. This meant he had knowingly kept this from me. I was furious. I waited for him to return from golfing with his friends. When he came back, he saw me sitting with all his bills laid out on the table, and he became hysterical. He started yelling at me about why I was going through his bills, and I told him how I knew everything and that he could no longer hide it from me. Ron tried to backtrack, saying they were just a few bills and that he was working on paying them off. I asked why he hadn't paid them, given he was earning income every month from his job. That's when Ron confessed he had been unemployed for the past 4 months. I was stunned by this revelation, as he had been going to the office once a week as usual for the last 4 months, and the rest of the time, we were texting while I was at the office and he was supposedly working from home. I asked him how this happened and why he never told me. Ron opened up about how his boss was a jerk and had gone back on his word, pressuring Ron to come to the office every day since the company was taking on more clients and Ron needed to attend more in-person meetings. However, Ron felt it was disrespectful, and he and the boss had a disagreement that resulted in Ron being fired. Ron went on to say it wasn't a big deal and that he could get a job in no time when he started looking. My eyes widened in shock as I asked what on earth he had been doing for the last 4 months if he hadn't applied for a job yet. Ron replied that he was taking a break for his mental health and that I shouldn't blame him for any of this. I told him that even if he had lost his job, it didn't make sense why he couldn't pay his bills since he supposedly came from a wealthy family. Ron told me that he had asked his parents for help, but they had refused. He vented about how his parents clearly favored his older sister more and how it was unfair. I felt like my entire relationship with him had been a lie. The illusion he had portrayed of himself was starting to crumble. Clearly, he wasn't rich, which is why he relied on me to pay his bills, while his unemployed self could keep buying luxury items and posting about them on social media. I told him firmly that I loved him, but this wasn't what I had signed up for. I explained that I knew exactly how it felt to be broke and had worked very hard to get out of that situation, so I wouldn't allow anyone to drag me back to that place. I informed him that if he didn't agree to change immediately and prove it through actions, I would leave his house with my things that very afternoon. I guess seeing me so angry really got through to Ron. He immediately apologized and sat down to discuss ways to deal with his debt. I told him he needed to sell his car, pay off all his credit card bills, and stop buying any luxury items for a while. Ron tried to refuse, saying how people would judge him and how his friends would make fun of him. I told him I honestly didn't care about any of that because he had growing debts that needed to be addressed first. He attempted to ask if I could help him pay part of the loan, but I refused and made it clear that this was his responsibility and that I would pay our monthly bills and handle any daily expenses. I made it clear that until he took proactive steps to reduce his debt, I wouldn't feel comfortable discussing a future with him. Reluctantly, he agreed. In the months that followed, he soon took proactive steps to address his debt. We put his car up for sale, and since it was a luxury sports car, we were lucky because we got enough from the sale to pay off his loan and even have some left over. He then cut unnecessary expenses and focused on paying off his credit card bills. As you can imagine, it was a tough time for him, as he wasn't used to cutting back on anything. There were moments of frustration and doubt, but I encouraged him to work hard to regain control of his finances. Eventually, Ron managed to pay off a significant portion of his debt. I was proud of the fact that he was trying. We discussed him getting a job, but that's when Ron told me about his plan to start his own business. He said he had an entrepreneurial spirit and wanted to explore it. I was strongly against this, as I'm much more risk-averse than Ron. I knew he could be very fickle at times and wasn't sure if he had the determination to focus on building a business. However, he had worked hard to pay off his debt, so I admit I didn't push back much during this time. Ron proposed to me, which caught me by surprise. He told me how he had listened to all my demands and paid off his debts, so now we could focus on starting a family together. I said yes because at the end of the day I truly loved him, and all I wanted was for him to keep working hard just like me so that we could build a life together. He informed me that his parents weren't aware he was going to propose, so he was a bit nervous about telling them. When he called to inform his parents, they told him that while they were happy for him and would support him, they really didn't expect him to end up with someone like me. On the other hand, my parents were thrilled for me. We had a small wedding because I didn't want to spend too much money and ruin our financial situation after Ron had just come out of debt. My parents kindly stepped in to help with our wedding expenses, and I also used money from my savings to pay for our wedding. Ron's contribution, on the other hand, was minimal despite his family's supposed wealth. Throughout all this, Ron remained silent, never correcting anyone's assumptions or acknowledging the truth, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. It was disheartening to see him enjoy the false praise, especially knowing he had been unemployed for months and hadn't contributed financially as one would expect. His parents also blatantly never corrected anyone, perhaps because they felt guilty. After that, they decided to pay for our honeymoon. This was unexpected on their part, but we accepted it since we might not have even gone on a honeymoon after our wedding otherwise. After our wedding and honeymoon, Ron worked on starting his own social media agency as he had decided. The agency was meant to work with brands and hire influencers. Undoubtedly, this is a very lucrative business, but there are hundreds of similar agencies, and it's difficult to stand out. He would constantly come home complaining about how he couldn't secure an influencer for an event or how he lost an influencer unwilling to negotiate. Additionally, brands rarely worked with new agencies, so it was really hard for him to find brands that trusted him enough to sign on. As a result, the business never generated income, and at times I begged him to go back to a regular 9-to-5 job, even if it wasn't as exciting. Ron would get furious and tell me how he needed time and that he would succeed. However, no matter how many events he attended or influencers he met, his business wasn't successful and was definitely unreliable. Meanwhile, I was growing frustrated being the sole provider, working every second I was awake. I would come home to more work, dishes left unwashed, laundry piling up, and the dog needing to be walked. On top of this, he expected me to cook for him while he told me about all the bills that needed to be paid. If I ever mentioned anything about my job, he would tell me how happy he was to have left his job because he couldn't handle being as stressed as I was. This really upset me because I was the one paying for everything with my stressful job while he was out partying every day at various events. Slowly, I began to resent him more and more. We did nothing together except watch TV, and I was starting to feel suffocated. On weekends, I would sleep a lot because I was constantly exhausted from working all week. If I ever asked him to help with housework, he would tell me that starting a business required of his energy and that, as his partner, I should be more understanding. Last month, on top of all this stress, I found out I was pregnant. Now, I had always imagined being pregnant and having a baby, but for some reason I felt this wasn't how I wanted to start a family. I mean, when you bring a child into this world, you want them to have a stable home and 2 providing parents. However, in our case, I was the only one providing, and he wasn't doing anything to contribute to the household. If I had a child, it would only mean even more work on top of everything I was already doing. I decided to talk to him about my thoughts. Unlike me, Ron was thrilled and hugged me in excitement. He told me how wonderful this news was, and that he couldn't wait to be a father. When I mentioned how exhausted I felt at home and how having a baby would only increase my workload, he agreed and said he would start taking on responsibilities at home. I was surprised by his enthusiasm and glad he was going to take action. In the past few weeks, Ron has been taking action. I mean, I still do 80% of the work at home like cooking, cleaning, and laundry, but he washes the dishes, takes out the trash, and walks the dog. I thought that, over time, we could get better and better. Eventually, this past weekend, he told me he was going to visit his family, so I informed him I would join since we wanted to make the pregnancy announcement together. I didn't exactly imagine his parents would be thrilled about our pregnancy, but when I announced the pregnancy, their faces literally dropped. His mother and sister scoffed at me and gave me the dirtiest looks, while his father looked down as if I had made a grave mistake. His mother looked me straight in the eye and told me this was simply ridiculous, that there was no need to bring a child into our marriage with the problems we were facing. I asked her what she meant, but she ignored me and excused herself from the table. Ron and I decided to leave because the atmosphere had clearly been ruined, and I had no idea why. On the way back, I asked him what his mother was talking about, but he shook his head, saying he had no idea, and kept saying it would be a good idea for him to continue visiting his family alone from now on. I felt really angry and disappointed with him because I had done absolutely nothing wrong for his family to treat me this way, and with the baby coming, I thought that for once, we could put the past aside for the sake of the child. Yesterday, while I was at work, I got a call from my sister-in-law. She had never called me before unless it was something really important, so I immediately answered, thinking something might have happened to my husband or his parents. During our conversation, my sister-in-law told me how she had spoken to Ron, who felt they were treating me disrespectfully, but she wanted to finally tell me why everyone felt this way. She then went on to tell me that she knew we were struggling because of all the debt I had, and that they didn't appreciate all the work Ron was doing for me while I wasn't contributing financially. I took a moment to process the information, and then asked her to explain exactly what she meant because I was confused by what she was implying. My sister-in-law then continued, saying Ron had told them that I had massive debts, and that he was the one who had to pay for everything by selling his car and even sacrificing by not buying luxury brands. My head was spinning as she kept telling me how she couldn't let her brother suffer anymore, and that I shouldn't trap him with a baby. I can't even begin to express how angry I felt at that moment. This spoiled child had gone and lied to his family, saying I was in debt just to save face. Clearly, he didn't want people to think he was broke, so he made up this ridiculous story where he could put the blame on me. Here I was, working hard day and night at a job I didn't like just to pay our bills, while he kept making up stories. I was so angry that I didn't even want to explain anything to his sister. I just told her she was right, and I shouldn't trap him with a baby since he wasn't worthy of being a father anyway. Then I hung up the call and informed my boss that I wasn't feeling well so I could go home early. I knew my husband was out meeting an influencer, so I quickly packed my things to move out with my dog. I didn't even bother leaving a note. I just left with everything I could fit in my car. Since yesterday, I've been staying at my parents' house while Ron has been frantically calling me. He must have talked to his sister because he's been sending me messages saying he can explain everything and just needs me to come back home. My parents don't know the details yet, but they can see it's serious, so they haven't asked too many questions. Honestly, I'm at a crossroads. On one hand, I'm pregnant and want my child to have a father, but on the other, I don't want to be with someone who has been lying about me when I've given so much. Am I wrong for considering divorcing my husband after what my sister-in-law revealed? Update 1. I talked to my parents about everything, and they agree, just like everyone on Reddit, that I need to leave my husband. What he has done is truly unforgivable. He went to the extreme of lying about me for years, even though I had been nothing but a good and loyal partner to him. The audacity he had to lie and say it was my debt shows I can't trust him. I'm planning to talk to him and let him know about my decision to divorce. Update 2. It's been a week since my last update. I talked to my husband 2 days ago. He had been calling and messaging me non-stop. He even reached out to my parents, who told him I was staying with them but didn't give him any more information. He came to my parents' house yesterday so we could talk. He was clearly shocked and started apologizing immediately. I asked if he even knew why he was apologizing, and he nodded, telling me that after I left, he called everyone, and his sister informed him about her conversation with me, so he realized I had found out. I asked him why he would tell such atrocious lies about me, and how insulted I felt when his sister called me to say I was trapping him with a baby. He nodded remorsefully and went on to tell me how he had always felt insecure around his family members. He told me all his parents cared about was wealth and status, so he was too ashamed to tell them the truth. He continued, saying that when his family asked where his car was, it was easier to blame me and spin a story about how I was in debt and he was helping me, rather than owning up to his mistakes. He said he never thought it would be a big deal since I wasn't close to his family anyway. I shook my head in disappointment and told him I had no idea he could be so unpleasant and manipulative. I reminded him how hard I had worked all these years to support us, yet here he was, shamelessly admitting how easily he had betrayed me. I told him I was divorcing him. Upon hearing this, he started pleading with me not to, saying we should think about the baby, but I told him we didn't have to be married to co-parent our child. I pointed out that the child would be much happier growing up in a stable environment, free from the tension and discord in our relationship. Despite his begging, I stood firm in my decision to end the marriage. Clearly, we had reached a point where staying together was no longer healthy for either of us. The thought of subjecting my child to a broken home filled with arguments and resentment was not something I was willing to consider. He pleaded a bit more, but in the end, he had to leave when he saw I wasn't changing my mind. He tried to apologize to my parents before leaving, but they just looked at him in disappointment and didn't respond. Update 3. Many of you suggested I reach out to his family and clear everything up. While I don't want to see them, I do believe it's fair to tell them the truth once and for all. So, I sat down and wrote a long email to his parents and sister yesterday, detailing every expense I paid for Ron, along with screenshots of payments from my bank account. I wrote about how he was the one with debt and bills piling up while continuing to buy one luxury item after another. I let them know I didn't want anything from them and that Ron was free to walk away from my child if he wanted to, but he would be required to pay child support every month. I informed them of my decision to divorce Ron and told them they could finally have their wish and marry him off to a much wealthier woman. Since my email, Ron has sent me angry messages as his parents and sister have been bombarding him, furious about his lies. They've even called me, but I haven't bothered to answer. His sister has messaged me apologizing for what she said and is begging me not to walk away from the family. Honestly, I don't care about their apologies or opinions at this point. I've already made my decision to move forward with the divorce, so I'll be meeting with a divorce attorney next week. As for my pregnancy, I'm determined to provide a stable and loving environment for my baby, even if it means co-parenting with Ron separately. Update 4. After discussions with my lawyer and reflecting on the situation, I've decided to take further legal action against my ex-husband Ron, since he blatantly lied about me to his family and made them believe I was the one responsible for his debts. I've decided to sue him for the money I contributed to paying off his debts during our marriage. My lawyer is preparing the necessary legal documents to start the lawsuit. I'm determined to get back every penny I invested in his so-called debt, since he took advantage of my generosity and lied about my financial situation to his family. While I know this additional step may create more tension, I feel it's necessary to seek justice and protect my financial integrity. The reaction from Ron's family has been, predictably, negative. They're furious about my decision to divorce him and now also about the lawsuit I'm filing. They've expressed outrage and tried to contact me, pressuring me to drop the lawsuit. However, I'm determined to proceed with this legal process to ensure justice is served. Though I know this path may be challenging and complicated, I'm committed to standing up for my rights and ensuring my financial integrity is respected. Update 5. Good news. After a lengthy legal process, I finally won the lawsuit against my ex-husband Ron. The court determined that he was responsible for the debt he had accrued, and that lying about my financial situation was completely unjust. As a result, Ron's family is now paying back all the money I contributed to help pay off his debts during our marriage. This includes not only the bills and expenses, but also damages.